Do you like fishing? Out in a lake, with a rod, with a few best friends? Or being completely alone, pondering on life? What if you weren't alone? What if, from the water beneath, there was a girl waiting to drag you down there with her? Or strange demonic entities in the woods? What if, instead of being the fisherman, you were forced to become the fish, being lured in by a mysterious bait and hooked by some unknown force? Grab a blanket, turn off your lights, and get ready for 3 true fishing ghost stories. Good luck. Late night of fishing. So my cousins and I were fishing for catfish one night at one of my dad's ponds in Kentucky. The night started off a bit weird. We were fishing at about 9 p.m. The place we were fishing was only accessible by animals from the sides of us. There was a creek behind us, and everything else was basically the woods. We were talking about all kinds of things throughout the night, and we were getting into discussions about life and death. We were hearing noises that were out of the ordinary. Awkward noises you hear in the woods. They were like women's voices. We weren't getting any bites, so we decided that we would leave at 11 p.m. if we didn't catch anything. As 11 came closer, we weren't close to leaving, but still, not a touch of bait. At 11, all of a sudden, I heard the loudest growl that shook me. I felt something on the right of me and jumped as high and as quick as I ever had before. I turned to my cousin, who was sitting on my left, and saw a terrified look on his face. Not wanting to jump to conclusions, I asked him what was wrong. He said, "Did you hear that?" I asked him, "What'd you hear?" He said, "That crazy growl, it shook my whole body." I looked at him and asked, "Are you sure?" He was sure. So I told him what I heard. After it happened, it was completely quiet. No rustling of the leaves, nothing. Almost like everything just shut up. We drove around the pond a couple times to see what we might be able to find, but nothing. We decided whatever it was didn't want us there, so we went back. The next day, I was telling my other cousin about it. This is when things get even weirder. The mule we drove down to the pond had an hour meter on it. It read a little past 666, which would have put it on 666. But it was 0 when we were fishing. I've heard wolves, coyotes, and other things growl out in the woods before, but this wasn't anything like it. This growl was different. And to be honest, the first thing that I thought was a demon or something demonic. We even went back the next few nights, but nothing. I wish I could better explain what it was, but it was pitch black out, and when I looked in the direction, I saw nothing but black. Old fishing shack ghosts. Growing up in St. John's Parish, Louisiana, in my grandparents' home, and their guest house, we always had plenty of relatives visiting. Mostly because the house was cooler in the summer than theirs, and we had a little creek running through the property that us kids would play in when it got too hot. I grew up with some 15 cousins and 9 aunts and uncles on my mother's side of the family, so there was no shortage of people to keep me entertained as a youngster. The house was a big plantation house that my grandpa Joshua got it in the will from his uncle Maurice when he married my grandma Marlena. It was spooky and had plenty of its own ghosts, which I'll tell you about another time. Summer came as it did in the South, hot, humid, and plenty of bugs to boot. But for us kids, it meant time off from school and time to play with various cousins who turned up over the break. And most of us were daredevils, myself especially, a real tomboy. If there was a tree to be climbed or a dare to be dared, I was usually the first one to do it first, much to the horror of my parents, who didn't think their daughter, me, should be playing rough games with the boys. Us kids loved exploring around the plantation and its surrounding areas, close enough still so we could still hear anyone calling us, but far enough we felt like we had the whole world to ourselves and no adults. Down the road a bit from the house was a small shack on the banks of a bigger stream. It was no more than an old fishing and hunting shack, but for us kids, which consisted of my cousin Peter, Mitch, Vince, and I, found it to be what looked like a perfect getaway. And as it wasn't occupied at the time, it turned into our clubhouse of sorts. My grandparents knew the place and warned us to be careful of the rotten boards in the floor and to be back before dinner time. We were ecstatic when Grammy, as we called her, made us curtains for the little windows, and Grandpa gave us some old furniture to use in the house, a table, 4 chairs, and a small cupboard to keep things in. Later, we would have fishing poles and a small icebox for drinks, too. It was only a small one-room deal, and the roof leaked when it rained, but to us, it was perfect. Once the furniture was in there was almost no room, and we had to keep the door open if we were inside so we could get in and out. Otherwise, there was no room for the door to open. Once everything was in place, Grandpa and Grammy came to visit and see how we'd done. As I said, we made a good place for us to play. For weeks every day, we went there and played, fished, and explored the woods and waterways around the shack. Grammy would bring us lunch, and sometimes we would bring back a fish or two for our efforts like proud hunters, you could say. Grammy was always happy when we brought back fish and cleaned and cooked them for us. They were always nice when she made them. It was my cousin Vince, 8 at the time, I was 9, who first noticed that the shack was a little different. Nothing much at first. We would leave the chairs in, to the table, when we left always. But often, we would be back and they were moved out, like people had been sitting at the table. Other times, the window that we left open in the day, as we went out fishing or exploring, we'd come back and they'd be shut, and the shades pulled too. We'd ask each other, did you leave the chairs out or close the windows? And everyone would say that, we didn't. You were with us and when we left. One day, Vince said to me that he and Mitch, his brother, had been in the cabin, and Mitch had to go back to the house as he needed the washroom. So he left Vince there to look after the fishing poles. Peter and I were getting blackberries down the stream and heard a splash and a yelp. It sent us running buckets and all the way back to the cabin in time to see Vince climbing out of the stream soaking wet. He started yelling, "Okay, who pushed me? It's not funny." Peter and I looked at him and I said, "Well, we were upstream picking berries. It wasn't us." And Vince looked around for Mitch, who was still on his way back from the house at the time. When he got back, Vince questioned his brother. Mitch said it couldn't be him. He was at the house at the time and just came back as we saw him. Vince went pale and said that he had been sitting there minding his business and holding the fishing poles when he heard steps behind him. Then, as he was about to turn around to see who it was, felt a strong, sharp push in the back, and the next thing he knew, he was in the stream. When he got out, he looked around but couldn't see anyone. And poor Vince was scared out of his 11-year-old mind. He ran home to change and wouldn't come back for almost a week. He was sure that place had a strange spirit or something that liked pushing kids in the water. We tried to tell our parents, but they laughed and said it wasn't funny to play jokes like that on each other, but none of us was near him when it happened. So who or what pushed Vince in the stream? Other things that would happen, we would be out on the dock-like thing at the front of the shack fishing, and we would hear heavy footsteps going back and forth across the shack when no one was inside. It was impossible for anyone to do this, as the furniture we had would have stopped at such a pace. Several times, when separated from each other, we would hear someone calling our names, telling us to go back to the house as someone there wanted us. We would go back to the house only to find that no one there had called us, and that at the time we weren't needed. The voice always sounded like my grandpa, no one else. Only him. Food and toys would be moved and sometimes vanish for days at a time. Mostly they would resurface, but never where they would be left. One toy, a yo-yo belonging to Mitch, came back with no string on it when it had a string when it disappeared. We never found the string, and one fishing creel disappeared the whole summer only to reappear the last day we were there. It was also smashed to pieces when it was new when it disappeared. That was the last full summer we lived in Louisiana. The next year, just before I turned 10, my parents moved to Nashville for my dad's work. Even though we went there the next year to see my grandparents, the shack had been blown down in a storm just before Thanksgiving the previous year and was totally destroyed. Only the dock remained. We never knew whom or what haunted that old one-room shack. Rumors were that my grandpa's former neighbor, a guy called Cliff Moritz' dad, Ellis, built the place in about 1910. He died in the 1930s, and Cliff died in the 1960s. They were fond of the fishing shack and spent all their spare time there in life when the weather was fine. Maybe they didn't like some rowdy kids playing there. We don't know. My grandpa died in 1979 from cancer, and my Grammy in 1988 from heart problems to do with diabetes, and the place was passed on to my aunt and uncle. The main house burnt down in the 1990s, and they weren't there at the time. Some families still stay in the guest house that still stands. Myself, I haven't been back since Grammy died, and frankly, I really have no reason to. I still have weird dreams about that shack. Ghost of Cape Cod. This is a true ghost experience that happened to my dad when he had gone to Cape Cod years ago. I'm telling it how he told me. He was fishing one night on Nauset Beach Or Nauset Light Beach, I can't remember which one. He said it was the perfect night to be fishing, a full moon. Apart from one couple, no one else there, and it was just so relaxing. He was having a nice time when he realized that who he thought was a couple down the shore was actually a woman. She kept shaking this blanket and wouldn't stop. He thought there must have been a lot of bugs out where she was. The fishing was still going great, but then he decided it was time to head back to the house. He got all his fishing gear along with all his other stuff and headed up the stairs to his car. He remembers that he knew the woman was walking behind him, so he stepped aside to let her pass, but no one was there. He thought nothing of it until a few weeks later when he was watching a show about Cape Cod hauntings. The show mentioned the ghost of Goody Hallett, the girl who danced around shaking a blanket, waiting for her husband to return home on the exact same beach my dad was on. They say she comes out in front of people who don't know of her and who aren't looking for her. And that just happened to be my dad at this time. Also, she only comes out on full moons, they say. And as I mentioned before, there was a full moon. As soon as my dad saw this on TV, he freaked out. Are any of you interested in Goody Hallett or any other Cape Cod hauntings? I went there this summer and nothing paranormal happened to me. Feel free to comment and tell me what you think.